We're going to be talking about aquatic ecosystems, so ecosystems that exist in water. Of course, one of the biggest, is the ocean. Earth is covered mostly by water from the ocean, so we're going to have a lot of ecosystems that exist in this area. There's going to be a couple big zones we want to talk about when we look at the ocean, because these different zones will have different characteristics and contain different living things. The first zone is the photic zone, and this is part of the ocean that receives sunlight. Remember, the ocean is very, very deep. There are many places in the ocean that are so far down that it doesn't get any sunlight. So when we look at the places that do get sunlight, we call that the photic zone. Photic means light. So this is the zone that gets light. So up towards the top part of the ocean where the sunlight's still going to be able to go through the water, we'll find some photosynthetic living things there, like plankton and algae, some plants that can get that sunlight and use it to make their own food. The aphotic zone is deeper down into the ocean where it's very dark, where sunlight does not get to. And this is where we find things that might glow in the dark. There are some glowing types of fish and other organisms, and like jellyfish that exist way deep down in the ocean. So lots of different weird adaptations happen there in that aphotic zone, but there's still a lot of life that exists there. There's also zones that are relative to the ocean's edges. So the intertidal zone, that's going to be where the tides go in and out. So like high tide, where the water comes up onto the beach, and then low tide would be where the water is at its lowest level during the day. So the intertidal zone, that's sort of where, like, if you've been to the beach, that's sort of where most people who go into the ocean spend most of their time, where the waves are kind of hitting onto the sand a little bit further, and where you can swim a little bit, where high and low tide take place. The neritic zone is a little bit farther out. That's going to be where if you were standing there, you wouldn't really be standing there because you wouldn't be touching the floor of the ocean. You'd be swimming. So a little bit further out would be the neritic zone. And those two places are going to be where a lot of life exists. Also, when we get into the open ocean, that's going to be farther away from land. We have two big zones that we look at. The first would be the pelagic zone. So that's going to be the open ocean, not near the coast. So way out where you wouldn't want to swim to. You'd want to be on a boat or a ship being out in this part of the ocean. And then also part of that open ocean down towards the bottom, down towards the sea floor, is called the benthic zone. And we have many things that live down there, like I said, in the dark. We have hydrothermal vents down there where volcanic activity happens. So different types of gases and sometimes lava are released down there. So the benthic zone, even though it's way deep down, has some interesting things that occur there. So if you have the chance to go to a beach, this slide should have some familiar pictures to some of you. This is going to be where water and the waves are crashing onto the sand. We see lots of living things here that exist that can deal with those changing environments where the water might be covering them during a certain part of the day during high tide, and then during low tide they might not be covered by water. So we can see in some of these pictures, for example, the starfish up in the top middle picture hanging on to some rock there. They're exposed during low tide in that picture. So they're going to have to deal with some amount of time where they're not covered by water. Some beaches in this area will be very sandy. Some will be very, very rocky. We'll see lots of things like shellfish and crabs that live in this area, because think about living in this area, you have water crashing down on you all the time. You have rocks and sediment moving around. You have to have kind of a tough outside of your body. We have an exoskeleton. on things like our crabs and our shellfish, things to protect them, to keep them from getting damaged when things are crashing down on them. Things like your crabs, they will also burrow into the sand if they get exposed out of the water, because things like birds and other predators might want to eat them. So they'll hide down in the sand and stay wet while the water and low tide has left them. And then when the water comes back up, they'll come out of that sand. So you might have been at the beach and see crabs burrowing down to the sand. That's part of the reason why they're doing that, to hide and to protect themselves. So once again, your intertidal zone, if you go to the beach, that's where you're going to be spending most of your time. The neritic zone is a little bit further out from the intertidal zone. So it goes from the edge of the intertidal zone over the continental shelf of our continents that exist underneath our ocean, as you can see in the top middle picture. Still, the water is relatively shallow. Once again, you can't stand in it. This is going to be, an area where you probably, if you ever go scuba diving, this is where, the area that you would be scuba diving in. We have coral reefs that exist in this area. We have lots of places in this area where life can exist and find shelter. So this is the most productive zone of the ocean. What I mean by that is it's going to contain the most life. Okay, it's going to have millions and millions of species. Some of the reasons for that is because this area still gets a lot of sunlight. This area also has a lot of things like coral reefs and shelters that other fish and organisms can live in. Also in this area, something called upwelling occurs. This is where strong currents carry nutrients from the ocean bottom and mix them with nutrients contained in runoff from the land. So you have a mixture of nutrients in this area, some from land, some from the bottom of the ocean. So there's lots of food. There's lots of things for these living things, and that's why this area contains so much life. Plankton exists a lot in this area, so small organisms that exist and drift on ocean currents. A lot of them are photosynthetic, so they'll use the sunlight to make food for themselves, and then smaller fish will eat the plankton to start the food web in the ocean. So really important part of the neritic zone, plankton play. Also, we said coral reefs are in this area, so these are built by coral animals over long periods of time. One thing that's going on in our oceans right now, however, is a lot of our coral reefs are dying off due to the changing of our oceans and the changing of our climate. And we'll be talking a lot about that next chapter. But just for now, coral reefs, they're actually called the rainforests of the ocean. They contain a lot of life. So moving out into the big open ocean, which we call the pelagic zone and the benthic zone. Those two zones make up the oceanic zone, so that encompasses the deepest parts of the ocean. So this is way far out from land. About half of photosynthesis that occurs on Earth takes place in the oceanic zone. So this area is so big that the plankton, there's so much room for plankton to live there that about half of photosynthesis takes place there. So we still have a lot of photosynthesis that takes place in the top part of the oceanic zone. Remember, as you get deeper down into the oceanic zone, there's not going to be sunlight. So a lot of these pictures that we see here show us things that live way deep down in the ocean. The whale in that picture would be one that lives closer towards the middle on the top, but all of the other ones here show us creatures that live way deep down in the ocean. Some of them glow to communicate with each other or to attract prey. If you ever watched Finding Nemo, the angler fish is one of the most common ones. We see it down toward the lower right side of this slide, the fish down there with the big teeth and like the little almost antenna-like thing coming off of its head. That's a good example of things that live and are adapted to live way deep down in the ocean. Moving away from the ocean and to other water ecosystems, we have one called an estuary. And this occurs where freshwater rivers and streams flow into the sea. So we have a mixture of salt and fresh water in these areas. Some examples include bays, mudflats, mangrove swamps, and salt marshes. All of these areas are going to be types of estuaries. These areas have shallow water and they receive a lot of light and they receive a lot of minerals from the river. So there's lots of opportunity for organisms to live here because there's lots of nutrients. And one of the things that we see in these areas is they usually contain a type of moss called sphagnum moss that helps to create a food web in this area. We are probably most familiar with the freshwater zones in our area. This includes things like lakes and ponds, for example. There's actually two categories of lakes and ponds when we look at what the water's like. A eutrophic lake has rich organic matter and vegetation, so the waters are kind of murky. And this is what we see with a lot of ponds and lakes in our area, as we can see in the picture up towards the top. Usually lots of algae and plant life living in them. Even though the water looks pretty dirty, it's not very clear. It actually is very good for lots of the living things that are there. Obviously, the plant life, the frogs, the snakes, the fish. We're used to seeing those things in those types of ponds. Another type of lake is an oligotrophic lake, and we can see it down towards the bottom left picture here. Those two pictures to the left. These lakes contain little organic matter, and the bottom of the lake is usually sandy or rocky, so they're usually going to be more clear. We don't have a lot of these in our area. Our area has more eutrophic types of ponds and lakes. Of course, rivers and streams we're also familiar with being fresh water. So these are bodies of fresh water that flow down a gradient towards the mouth of the river. So these are going to be areas of water that are constantly moving. Some of the things that live in these areas, we have trout and salmon. And you think of the things that live around those areas, they supply a lot of water to living things like deer and bear and wolves. So these are very important water systems on Earth. Another freshwater ecosystem that you've probably heard of are wetlands, and these are areas of land that are covered with fresh water for at least part of the year. So these places I kind of think of them as being like a soaked sponge. Sometimes there's so much water that you have water up on top of the land, and sometimes the land's just really, really wet underneath. This is the most productive freshwater ecosystem since there is so much land contained in the ecosystem. We can see pictures of different wetland areas here. We have a lot of them down towards the south in Florida and Louisiana. These are important stopping points for migrating birds. So when birds migrate, they often stop here for food or they mate in these areas. So they are very, very important for a lot of life, not just the life that lives there, but also the life that migrates there. These areas provide protection for spawning organisms, for organisms that are reproducing. So once again, a big area of reproduction for different organisms. These areas also act as filters and clean pollutants out of the water. You have all of this plant life and rock and land that exists in this water, and as the water is moving through, it gets cleaned, it gets filtered. So wetlands are very important for doing that. Some of our wetlands, once again, have been damaged by different types of catastrophes. For example, the big oil spill that happened about 10 years ago, the BP oil spill, affected a lot of the wetlands in Louisiana, covered it in a lot of oil, harmed a lot of the wildlife there, killed off a lot of the plants there. So these areas are pretty fragile and they're recovering in some areas, but we want to make sure that we protect them because they help all of our organisms reproduce in those areas, and they also help clean the water, and they help soak in water like a sponge, so they can actually help reduce flooding to places that are further inland. So if there's a city that exists kind of behind a wetland, that wetland area can actually help reduce flooding because it soaks up a lot of that water. So they act as flood control. So there are two main categories of wetlands. Marshes, these are going to be wetlands that contain non-woody plants. So lots of tall grasses and weeds, things that don't have bark on their stems. Those are going to be marshes. So they're a little bit easier to walk through if you were an animal walking through those areas. The plant life is not going to be very, very tough. It's going to be mostly big grasses and things like that. Swamps, they're going to contain more woody plants, so more trees and big bushes and logs. So there's going to be more places for organisms to take shelter in those trees and in those big plants, like we can see in this picture here of the crocodile in the middle. But that's going to be the difference between those. Marshes do not contain woody plants. Swamps do contain a lot of them. Just a little question to finish us up here about our ecosystems. This one is actually talking about our land ecosystems. So a question from something that we did last week. Which choice below lists the biomes in order from lowest average temperature to highest average temperature? So for these choices, we want to make sure that we're following the order from lowest to highest temperature. So if we take choice A, for example, the taiga, that's going to be up in Canada, so pretty cold. And as we move over to the tropical rainforest, that is going to be warmer than the taiga, so that's good. And then as we move to the grasslands, those places are actually going to normally be a little bit colder than the tropical rainforest. So choice A is not going to be a good list because it starts out okay, but then it kind of mixes up the choices. So choice A would not be the best one. For choice B, once again, the taiga is pretty cold. It's in Canada. That's going to be colder than the temperate deciduous forest. So for B, this is looking good so far. And then the last part of B, there's the savanna, is going to be warmer than the deciduous forest and the taiga. So actually B works out really well. So that's a good answer. But let's check out the other ones there and make sure they're incorrect. For C, the tundra is very cold. The grasslands are going to be much warmer than the tundra. But then the taiga is going to be colder than the grasslands. So they're not in order. So C would not be the best answer there. And then for D, the tundra is very cold. The savanna is going to be warmer than the tundra. However, the temperate deciduous forest is not going to be warmer than the savanna. So the best answer for this question would be B. That one does list them in order from the lowest temperature on average to the highest temperature on average.